this afternoon is called One Half of Humanity, Women in History and Religion. It was mainly designed for non-Baha'is and for public meetings, but in fact I've found that over the years giving it, and as it's grown and so on, that it has become of as much interest to the Baha'is themselves, and if nothing else it can perhaps give you ammunition in dealing with the subject of equality, and it may help to give you some information that you can use when talking to people interested in this particular thing. So bear that in mind. A lot of the information I'm going to use is not drawn from Baha'i sources, but at the end I draw the threads together and put them into a Baha'i perspective. Please bear in mind then that this talk is being given by a man, for as Virginia Woolf said, to praise one's own sex is always suspect, often silly. Well, I'm not an expert. Anyone can come by the same information, though you sometimes have to look very hard to find it. You might wonder what my motives are. You might wonder if they are indeed suspect. And I would say, well, that's fine. A healthy mind is a sceptical one. I believe in the elimination of all forms of prejudice. I believe that no one should be treated any differently because of an accident of birth. I believe that no one should be allowed to remain in ignorance of the reasons that account for them being treated differently. I believe in universal education as the chief means of dispelling such ignorance. And I believe that universal education starts with self-education. This is something that was written in 1783 on the education of women. Draw near, woman, and hear what I have to say. Turn your curiosity, for once, towards useful objects, and consider the advantages which nature gave you, and society ravished away. Come and learn how you were born the companion of man, and became his slave, how you grew to like the condition, and think it natural, and finally how the long habituation of slavery so degraded you that you preferred its sapping but convenient vices to the more difficult virtues of freedom and repute. If the picture I shall paint leaves you in command of yourselves, if you can contemplate it without emotion, then go back to your futile pastimes. There is no remedy. The vices have become the custom. Humanity is divided into two halves, a basic fact that no one disputes. But I would ask, are the two halves equal in participation, in responsibility, or in opportunity? Women are 50% of the world's population. They put in 2/3 of the world's working hours, receive 10% of the world's income, and own less than 1% of the world's property. Has it always been that way? Well, according to the whole course of recorded history as most of us receive it, yes. The whole of history has indeed been dominated by the masculine principle. But was there ever a change at any time in the past? And if so, why did it occur? When and how? Will the relative positions of the sexes be rectified in the future? If women have been subordinate and subordinated throughout history, are there any differences in men and women which might account for their relative positions? Is it because women are truly inferior to men? Or is it because it has somehow become established belief that they are inferior? Well, this talk is a brief attempt to examine these questions, and there's no promise to provide all the answers. We'll look first at the physical evidence. Are there physical differences in men and women which are sufficient to account for their relative historical positions? So in what ways are men and women physically different? Now it's interesting for me, having started to write this talk 10 years ago, and reading books that have come out over the 10 years, and to see the subtle shift and the almost complete reverse but I believe that all this shifting has been necessary. So what I say at first, I may not say exactly toward the end, so you'll pardon me. Okay, let's start with the basis of the difference, the chromosomes in the human cells. Of the 23 chromosome pairs in human cells, only one pair contain the sex-determining genes. All female eggs, the ova, contain an X chromosome, but half the spermatozoa contain X chromosomes and half Y. So a double X combination produces a female child, an X and a Y, a male child. The Y chromosome is actually a stunted version of the X chromosome and fails to counteract genetic defects carried by X chromosomes. Males, as a result, suffer skin deformities, webbing between the toes, colour blindness, and haemophilia, with about 30 other conditions. The result is that women are constitutionally stronger, on average, and they live longer. It's interesting to note that there are slightly more males produced at birth, and one wonders if this is some kind of natural compensation. Criminologists are quick to demonstrate that among violent criminals there is a common occurrence of an X double Y combination, which is also generally linked to mental deficiency. No genetic inferiority of women seems apparent. Rather, the evidence seems to point the other way. As for bone structure, well, much is made of the differences in the skeletons of men and women and in the size, weight, and shape of their bones. But bones are organic. They're sensitive to muscular action, diet, posture, and fashion. Differing lifestyles will alter identical bone structures differently. Occupations alter musculature, which in turn determines bone alignment and size. Corseting and binding at the waist serves to expand the ribcage and hips, while regular athletic swimming broadens the shoulders and narrows the hips. The classic wide hips of the woman, says Germaine Greer, are as much a function of her enforced sedentary roles in society and her clothing as they are a natural aid to childbearing. In most women, the pelvic girdle is tilted backwards at a marginally greater angle to support the fetus during pregnancy. The smaller skeletons of women, and consequently smaller weight and height, are a function perhaps of male selection over the millennia, preferring women smaller than themselves as mates, for the obvious reason that, of course, they can dominate them. But it's interesting to notice that in pre-classical Greece, men and women competed in the same athletic events side by side. And there is indeed a legend of a woman athlete who drops apples or fruit of some kind in the path of her male competitors in order to distract them in the race, so that she may win it clearly. So one might say that much of the disparity in skeletal makeup is not a direct function of gender, but an indirect result of the behaviour patterns imposed on the sexes by conventions of society, a subtle but important difference. And the extra rib in women is a myth, and you can count them if you don't believe me. Skin, shape, and hair. Popular mythology tells us that women are encased in an extra layer of subcutaneous fat, rather like the spongy inner tube of a tyre. Desmond Morris and Hugh Hefner would have us believe that this is to provide comfort and entertainment for men. Well, this is, to a certain extent, as fallacious as it is ridiculous. In fact, people of whatever gender, most of the excess fat is accumulated in the subcutaneous region. All repressed and indolent people are fat. Eunuchs grow fat, for example, as a result of sexual repression. In fact, women accumulate fat in certain specific areas, particularly the breasts, which is a natural aid to suckling newborn infants. A whole obscene culture, of course, has grown up around these deposits of adipose tissue, causing undignified and laughable behaviour not only in men, whose poetry and pornography are bound with descriptions of them, but in women, some of whom spend disproportionate amounts of time and money in worrying over their endowment in that area, purchasing all manner of supporting garments and cosmetic aids to appear more attractive to the male observer. It is in reaction to this, perhaps, that some feminists have burned their bras in public. There are as many stereotyped ideas about hair and its link with gender. Some people are hairy, some not. Many men struggle to grow beards or moustaches all their lives, while numerous women shave or use cosmetics to remove facial and body hair. Conventional demands that virile men should have hairy chests. I think if I count mine, I've probably got 3. And that women should not have bushy eyebrows. The latter are therefore sometimes plucked bare like a chicken carcass and redrawn with crayons to conform to social stipulation. Of course, when it comes to the sexual organs, the sexes differ mostly there. And one must readily admit that the woman's role in childbearing means that she is subject to the regular discomfort of menstruation from puberty to menopause, and to the burden of pregnancy itself, usually more than once in a lifetime. But these are not so debilitating as the attitudes toward them among men and women alike. Menstruation and pregnancy are often viewed as illnesses. The operation of the male reproductive system is fairly simple. Everything is external and visible. Knowledge of it is almost ubiquitous among even young boys, and as a teacher of children I can tell you that. The female system, however, is much more complex, almost entirely hidden, internal, mysterious, the butt of many smutty jokes and stupid superstitions. Misunderstanding and ignorance predominate throughout most women's lives, or perhaps now I should say many women's lives rather than most, about the workings of their own reproductive systems, which are vulnerable to disorder and disease. Lack of education about them often leads to late diagnosis and therefore unnecessary suffering and premature death. But is the woman defiled or inferior because of this? More likely she is victim of a male-dominated culture and education system which places too little stress on female physiology, among many other things. Coming to the mind and the psyche, this poses a more interesting problem. Male anatomists are quick to point out of context, that women's brains are on average 100 grams lighter than those of men. L. Langley even says, and I quote from The Physiology of Man, "The degree of intelligence is somehow related to the size and complexity of the cerebral cortex." Of course, we all know what he's getting at, but women are generally smaller than men in any case. And seeing as we make use of less than 10% of our brains, I fail to see what weight has to do with it anyway. Carl Jung and Virginia Woolf both speak of the androgynous nature of the mind and the psyche. That is, that both sexes have masculine and feminine elements in their mental and psychological makeup. What we might say is that women seem to have developed the intuitive aspect of the human mind further than men, but one wonders how far that is a function of being denied development in the rational faculties by men. Now that's what I wrote before reading a very interesting book called Sex and the Brain. A very interesting book because I was reading it on a plane journey to Geneva to visit Shiva, who was at the University of Lausanne for a brief period of study, and I got some very peculiar looks from the air hostesses. Actually, this book should say Gender in the Brain rather than Sex in the Brain. But the book talks about the results of recent scientific research. And this book points out that there has been a tendency since the 1960s to interfere with our body chemistries to try and physically make women and men to be more similar to one another, along with the ideas that men and women should be equal, has come the strange but related idea that men and women should therefore be the same in every respect. As Bahá'ís we know better. But it's interesting that this book points at the fundamental differences in the physical and therefore the psychological makeup of the brains of men and women. Scientific research has shown that women are more sensitive to touch. They have better fine motor coordination and finger dexterity, which is why you'll see more women engaged in knitting and crochet work and needlework than you will men. And looking around, we have a splendid example. There are great differences in information gathering and problem solving. Men are more rule-bound. less sensitive to situational variables, more single-minded, more narrowly focused, and more persevering. Women, however, are more sensitive to context, less hidebound by demands of a particular task, good at picking up peripheral information. They process their information much faster than men. This means, in simple terms, that women are better with sounds and with people. Hence they make good communicators, good peacemakers. Men are much better with objects in space. So they make better architects, better mathematicians, better physicists. Women are good at tasks requiring language ability. They excel in those areas where men are weak. They respond more to social sounds around them, to tones of voice and music. They have a much greater sensitivity to sound, and their hearing is better even in later life. They're much better at almost all the skills involving words: fluency, verbal reasoning, written prose, and reading. Their verbal memory is better. They can sing in tune 6 times more often than males. Men, however, are takers of action. They're good at tasks requiring visual and spatial skills. They're better at maps, mazes, and maths, at rotating objects in their minds, and locating 3-dimensional objects in 2-dimensional representations. They're better at perceiving and manipulating objects in space, better at orientating themselves in space. They have a good sense of direction. Males outnumber females 3-1, however, in remedial reading classes, which is interesting that they are as good as women are at the verbal and literacy skills. Men are poor. It's interesting to look at men and women and the different disabilities they suffer from. Women suffer from depression and hysteria, and what the scientists have dubbed mass disability, whereas males suffer from hyperactivity, autism, dyslexia, and stuttering, many of these functions of language. Now, if we were to base our social policy on these biological differences, we should have to lock up all the men, because they commit almost all the crime: murders, thefts, drunken driving, and so on. They're more aggressive, and they're more at risk of becoming psychopaths. In fact, in 1977, in Norway, they carried out statistics, and 98.5% of all crimes, 98.5% of all crimes were committed by the men. And it seems that the brains of men and women are very differently structured. And one way in which they're differently structured is that the bundle of nerves which connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain in women is much, much larger. And it's not something that develops later in life, but after 6 weeks in the womb, these differences appear. Now, we'll have to go back into evolution to find the answers as to why males and females are differently organised in their brains. And the scientists suggest that for 95% of our history, Homo sapiens has been a hunter-gatherer. And this form of society means that there have been strong selection pressures on men for survival, which means to hunt successfully, which means that they need accurate eyesight, they need to be strongly goal-directed, they need to have good overall motor control, an ability to calculate distance, direction, and the essentials of a situation. In other words, they have to make quick decisions when they're hunting animals. And these are exactly the sort of visual and spatial skills found by scientists in men today. And these skills take up a lot of neural space, as the scientists call it, and allow less space for skills which are actually more needed now in today's society. This form of society has meant strong selection pressures on women for survival in terms of holding the community together while the men were away hunting, which meant the development of maternal skills, social and cultural skills. And that meant more inter-hemispherical integration. And this means more space left for non-verbal communication skills and emotional sensitivity, which some people call intuition. For this reason, women make much better judges of character, because they're much more aware of what lies behind the words that people speak, facial expressions, stance, the way people wear their clothes. You ask a woman who's been to a party what she has observed and experienced, and she'll give you an extremely accurate description of what everybody was wearing and exactly the wording of what everybody has said and the way they said it and the expressions they had on their faces as they were saying it. You ask a man, he won't even be able to remember anything except the broad conceptual pattern of what people were talking about. But observing these differences in the minds of men and women, is this sufficient to say that there are, or there should be, any arguments for inferiority? Can they be the basis for any kind of discrimination? They don't make men superior and women inferior, merely superior and inferior in different ways. They are all the more reason why women should be allowed to have an equal share in the world's affairs at every level, precisely because they do not have the same skills or outlook as men. They are complementary. So we've seen that aggression has been a necessary part of man's makeup for human evolution. But unfortunately, aggression has the side effect of suppression of anything that is not as aggressive, and that usually means that the men have dominated the women. And to the extent that all our present historians, or most of them, are men, so they write the history about the men. So we hear very little about the women. But if we search through our history very diligently, we may find some counter-evidence to suggest that women are not inferior, that there have been some good examples of women who have achieved great things in the past, women whose names have often been buried, deliberately lost and forgotten. Who can name me the only true woman pharaoh in recorded history? And it wasn't Cleopatra, who was a client queen within a Roman-dominated world. Her name was Hatshepsut, reigning from 1503 to 1482 BC. Married to her half-brother, she ruled openly upon his death, breaking 2,000 years of masculine government in Egypt and continual warfare. Under her patronage, peace and prosperity arose, trade and arts flourished, and at her death, her son-in-law smashed all the statues raised in her name, erased her name from every monument, and sought to hide from the eyes of men all evidence of her, quote, shameful, unquote, rule. And this has been the pattern since recorded history began. Who can name the person who defeated and killed the king of Persia, Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus in the Persian? Her name was Tomyris, Celtic queen of the Massagetae, who in 529 BC requested Cyrus to leave her people alone as he was harassing her territory with his troops. And when he failed to withdraw his forces from her lands, she sent her son at the head of an army to expel the Medes and the Persians in Cyrus's army. The Celts were beaten that time, and her son was captured, but he killed himself rather than face slavery. On hearing the news of her son's death, Tomyris vowed that Cyrus would be given his fill of blood. She collected all her forces and gave battle a second time. And on this occasion the Persian army was defeated and Cyrus was killed. Taking the body of the king, Tomyris dipped his head in a skinful of gore and said, quote, I live and have conquered you in battle, yet by you I am destroyed, for you have taken my son. But thus I make good my threat and give you your fill of blood. Modern historians fail to record the reason and circumstances of Cyrus's death, but not the Greek historian Herodotus, our source, for he came from a matriarchal society. Who can name me the first woman martyr of the Christian Church? Her name was Thecla, disciple and convert of St. Paul, condemned to death but survived the stake and the amphitheatre at Antioch. The Acts of St. Paul and St. Thecla were canon scripture until 367 AD in the Western Church. They are now to be found only in the New Testament Apocrypha. She was greatly venerated in both the East, where her feast is still celebrated on the 24th of September, and the West, where her feast day was the 23rd of September, until suppressed by the Vatican in 1969. Yet she is acclaimed as a patron of Milan Cathedral. She came from Iconium and is said to be buried at Seleucia. She may have been responsible for writing the epistle to the Hebrews. If that were ever substantiated, I wonder how long that book would remain in canon scripture. Who can name the person who wiped out the crack 9th Legion of the Romans and went on to raze 3 cities, butchering 70,000 of their inhabitants in the process? Thank you, Betty. At last. Boadicea, yes. She was queen of the Iceni. When her husband, King Prasutagus, a client monarch of Rome, died in 59 AD, the cowardly and grasping procurator, Catus Decianus, sent his soldiers to reclaim the loans made to Prasutagus to help him accomplish the Romanization of his people. Boadicea resisted the intervention, and for her noble courage, was publicly flogged before her subjects to within an inch of her life, and her 2 daughters were raped. All her property was confiscated, all the Iceni nobles were stripped and sold into slavery, and the palace was overrun and sacked. Horrendous as all this was, it was merely the last straw of a whole haystack of affronts and indignities heaped upon the Celtic Britons by the invaders, not the least of which was the seizure of Celtic land to build a Roman temple, and the expense of the upkeep of which was laid upon the Celts themselves. Revenge was swift and terrible. In 60 AD, Boadicea rallied the Iceni and the Trinovantes and marched on Colchester, which was burned to the ground. The Celtic queen had chosen her moment well. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was far away in Anglesey, storming the last stronghold of the Druids. London fell under the sword and torch, and St. Albans followed. Everyone found there, Roman, Briton, Romano-Celt, was butchered and impaled upright on sharpened stakes. Finally, the unwieldy Celtic horde, many thousand strong, was met, pinned down, and slaughtered by a smaller but more disciplined Roman army under the governor. Knowing what would be their fate, Boadicea and her daughters took poison. For their part in the uprising, the Iceni were hunted down and exterminated. The procurator fled to Gaul, and the governor was replaced. Now, had Boadicea been more brave, had she been a man, let's say, her deeds would have been sung in heroic strains as a champion of the oppressed. Instead, her revolt is spoken of in hushed and horrified tones, too hideous to deserve any praise, and are too little close for comfort for the military men and civil servants of yesteryear, and now, to contemplate. And I can go on to describe to you Zenobia, a queen who arose in Syria, in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And it's interesting that, it's almost unique, I think, that a Reverend Henry Allen said of Zenobia, perhaps one of the most remarkable women of history, just and merciful in her rule, strong in her domestic affections, and in her monarchical pride, and of great personal beauty. Of course, heroines always have to be beautiful for men to describe them. Intense patriotism, sagacious statesmanship, profound philosophical thought, heroic personal valour. She almost realises the ideal of a great sovereign. But I ask you, how many times have you heard Zenobia quoted as an example of a great monarch? Who can name me the 5th century woman professor of philosophy, one of whose pupils became Bishop of Ptolemais? She was Hypatia, daughter of Theon of Alexandria. She was a Neoplatonist and occupied the chair of Platonic philosophy at Alexandria, lecturing on Plato and Aristotle, among others. She was cruelly murdered by a rioting mob, incited by the then Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, cut to pieces with seashells, apparently, in AD 415. She wrote several works which are all lost. I wonder why. Charles Kingsley wrote a novel about her. I think that's something else that's quite unique. And of course we have Joan of Arc, burned at the stake as a witch at the age of 19, canonised as a saint some years later. I say some years later, 400 years later, already nearer 500 years later. And now I think her sanctity has been withdrawn again. And who can name me the first woman to win the Nobel Prize? Marie Curie. Not only to win it once, but twice, a feat only equalled once since. She shared the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1903 with her husband Pierre and Becquerel, and in 1906 she became the first woman professor of physics in Paris or anywhere, appointed on her husband's death. Notice she had to wait until her husband was dead before she was given her true honours. In 1911, without her husband around to share the prize with her, she was given the solo Nobel Prize for Chemistry. She died in 1934 from leukemia as a result of exposure to the radioactive materials that she had worked with so laboriously for most of her adult life. So woman is one half of humanity, yet the history books are almost devoid of her mention, except where she appears as wife or daughter to some famous man. Anything of merit that she accomplishes is denounced as sorcery or attributed to a man. And if she actually does something shameful or barbaric, she is raised aloft as an example of feminine deviousness and inferiority. Might this be because, as I have suggested, most of our history books have been written by men? Or can it be said that women truly did little worth recording in history, and that this surely demonstrates their inferior status and justifies their continued suppression? Decide for yourself with the examples provided, and others that you might find if you search diligently enough. And if they're not sufficient as victims for male conspiracy, try this one for size. Pope John VIII, from 853 to 855 AD, was a woman, Pope Joan. So successful has the Catholic Church been in suppressing knowledge of her that most people are still unaware of her existence. Yet the Catholic Encyclopedia, 1910, Volume 8, tells of an English girl who, disguised as a monk, made her way to Athens, where her erudition caused her to be recognised and made a cardinal by Pope Leo IV. Upon his death in 853 AD, Joan was elected and served for just over 2 years, when she was discovered to be a woman and was stoned to death in the street during a papal procession, having there given birth to a child. So obviously one other person than Joan was aware that she was a woman. For many years the route of the papal procession was diverted to avoid that street, and in 1601, following taunts from German reformists, Pope Clement VIII officially declared Joan a myth and destroyed all records of her, including statues and inscriptions which had stood in prominent places until that day. Familiar story? And it's interesting to note that from 855 AD, all candidates for the papacy had to undergo a medical examination to prove their masculinity. The popes called John were also renumbered to conform with the obliteration, and Leo IV was made to live 2 years longer to fill the gap between his true death and the consecration of Benedict III. Let's have a look now at the religious question. Is there anything in past religions which might justify the treatment of women as supposedly being inferior? Let's first of all have a look at Judaism. In turning to Judaism, we find the origin and the source of Western anti-feminism, the root cause of the doctrines of female inferiority. For God first made man, who was called Adam, Genesis 2:7, and then he made animals and birds, Genesis 2:19, and finally, because none was fit to be Adam's help, God fashioned woman, Genesis 2:22, from Adam's rib, if you please. Quote, "She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man," Genesis 2:23. As it turned out, the woman, named Eve, wasn't much of a help to Adam, for she was beguiled by the serpent into disobeying God's command, Genesis 3, 1-5. And not only that, but she succeeded in gaining her husband's complicity in the sin and their eventual banishment from the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3, 6. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Genesis 3:16. So here, in the opening book of the Torah, the Old Testament, we see established in the minds of countless generations to come the relative positions of man and woman, woman's weaker moral fibre, and the idea that the pains of conception and childbirth are a punishment for her sinful nature. In Jewish religious observances, the woman is not subject to the same duties as the man, and no special observance marks her attainment of religious majority, unlike the man. Her function as mother is held to be sacred. Well, we don't disagree with that. Moses allowed a man to divorce his wife, Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, if he found no favour in her. And if a man died, the widow was expected to marry his brother, so that the deceased's inheritance should not be lost, Deuteronomy 25, 5. Naturally, the former was open to abuse, and unfortunately, moreover, the woman had no complementary recourse of action. Women were, and still are, held to be subservient and creatures of the hearth and home, and if allowed to wander abroad, prone to deceit, moral laxity, and general wickedness. Eve, Jezebel, and Delilah being quoted as prime examples of womanhood in this connection. But it is interesting, if you examine early Jewish history, that several women rose to great prominence, Jewish women. We hear of Deborah, who actually sat as a judge over all Israel, and together with Barak, her general, defeated the Canaanite army of Sisera. And it's interesting that the book of Esther, which biblical scholars say is really mythical or fictional in origin, should pick a woman as the heroine, the one who saved all the Jews from massacre in the Persian Empire. Turning to Hinduism and the religions of the East, the lot of the woman was and is unequivocally subservient to the man. In Hinduism, in marriage, she was wholly subject to her husband, revering him almost as a god. In fact, there's a brilliant description of this in a little article called Is Sexism a Sign of Decadence in Religion? By Leonard Swidler. I must read you some of this, it's delightful. This is quoted from the Pradma Purana, which is one of the Hindu scriptures. Be her husband deformed, aged, infirm, offensive in his manner, let him be choleric, debauched, immoral, a drunkard, a gambler, let him frequent places of ill repute, live in open sin with other women, have no affection for his home, let him behave like a lunatic, let him live without honour, let him be blind, deaf, dumb, or crippled. In a word, let his defects be that they may. A wife must always look upon him as her God. A wife must eat only after her husband has had his fill. If the latter fasts, she shall fast too. If he touch not food, she shall also not touch it. If he be in affliction, she shall be too. If he be cheerful, she shall share his joy. She must, on the death of her husband, allow herself to be burned. According to Buddhist sources, the Buddha disapproved of women as members of his renunciatory order and maintained that the life of the Buddhist teachings would be shortened by their entry. The Buddhist attitude to women may be summarized as follows. Is she old? Regard her as your mother. Is she honourable? Regard her as your sister. Is she of small account? Regard her as your younger sister. Is she a child? Treat her reverently and with politeness. Otherwise, the Buddhist standpoint seems to have been one of thinly disguised tolerance and mindful always of the dangers of carnal desires being aroused in the presence of women. It is in Christianity that we find the full horror of misogyny unleashed. Not, one might add, as the result of Christ's teachings or personal example, but of the church that grew up in his wake. Christ gave his love and compassion alike to prostitutes and publicans. He spoke freely to women of his message, and to those who came to him or were brought before him, he gave forgiveness and sent away peacefully. You must remember that at the time that Christ was teaching, it was forbidden for women to be taught the Torah. And yet Christ often explained to women of his acquaintance the message behind the Torah. He spoke little directly of women, but you can read in the Gospels yourselves of how when all the disciples had fled after Christ's arrest and trial, denying him to hang themselves or mourn or cower awaiting arrest, it was the women in Christ's ministry who dogged his path to the foot of the cross itself and waited until he was taken down. And of how on the morning of the third day, Mary Magdalene went to the sepulchre with spices for her Lord, and how the risen Christ appeared to her first among all people, and of how she, a woman, ran to the disciples and to their chief, Peter, to tell them of what had transpired. And again this, when women were forbidden to bear witness to the truth in a Jewish court of law, she was chosen by Christ to bear witness of the truth, of the reality of his spiritual resurrection. It was a woman who was the first to understand the meaning of Christ's rising from the dead. And it was she who had to explain it to the disciples of the Lord. For a time, the whole fate of the world and the church rested in the hands of a single, simple woman, a prostitute, out of whom Christ had previously cast 7 devils. Such was her love and faith, she outshone them all. And whenever her name was mentioned in the presence of Abdu'l-Baha, he would smile. Not on these things are the teachings of the church built, but on the words of St. Paul and his protege Timothy, who preached a doctrine of savage anti-feminism to a young community composed mostly of Jews and Gentile sympathizers of Judaism. The words of these 2 church fathers, and of many after them, came as a shock to the people of the Roman and Celtic worlds, who were to hear them later, for their women had enjoyed the right to divorce, birth control, property ownership, bearing of titles and inheritances, making of wills, filing of lawsuits, and all this was dramatically swept away by a young church unwittingly propagating the ideals of primitive Semitism. Consider for yourselves these extracts from the epistles of Paul and Timothy to the early Christian communities. 1 Corinthians 11, 8 and 9. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. Ephesians 5, 22 and 23 and 24. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. 1 Timothy 2, 11 and 12. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection, but I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. And what does Timothy use as his source to back all this up? For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Familiar? Such venerated church fathers as St. Augustine took this doctrine further and even suggested that women had no soul. Man alone was made in the image of God. The idea was actually debated at the Church Council of Macon in the 6th century AD, and had it not been for the intervention of some Celtic bishops from Britain, bred on a culture revering women, church doctrine could have well branded women as soulless henceforth. If we turn now to Islam, although Muhammad put a stop to the Arab tribal practice of burying daughters alive because they were considered too unworthy to remain living, the Quran itself is quite explicit on the subject of women. Surah 4, verse 34, "Men are superior to women because of the qualities whereby God has made a distinction between them, and because they expend their wealth to cover the cost of housekeeping." In Islam, the primary object of marriage is the propagation of children, which is perhaps partly the reason for allowing a man to have 4 wives, though only if he may be truly impartial in their treatment. But of course, Muslims in the past have forgotten that bit. The husband may divorce his wife at any time, though a woman cannot sue for divorce on any grounds, and her husband may beat her. In inheritance, the woman receives only half that of any male relatives. Her education beyond running of the home is not even considered, and in stepping beyond the confines of the household must go escorted and veiled. In The Guardian, on the 16th of September 1976, there appeared an article on the women in Bangladesh, and if anyone wants to read it, they may. Speaking very recently with a doctor of education, a lady from Bangladesh, I understand she's very rare. She assures me that the situation has not changed at all. Despised and rejected, the most miserable women on earth. Though that bears some reading. It's interesting that more or less at the same time as that article, The Guardian was also debating women priests in the Anglican Church, and whether the Church of England would admit visiting female priests from American Protestant churches, or even ordain their own. And I would say, yes, very nice, and a far cry from St. Paul, but I believe that the sentiment is wasted. As a Baha'i, obviously. Neither do men put wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runneth out. The question is not whether we should have women priests, but whether we should have priests. I can talk about the long struggle for emancipation, and I can list, but I won't. You can perhaps read through this for yourself, of all the women from ancient times through medieval times up until the time of Elizabeth I of England, when the Puritans took over England, and the Puritans were very much male-dominated and chauvinistic, how many of them made great contributions to scholarship, and to literature and art and so on. And it's interesting that in A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf posits a possible sister of Shakespeare who shared his genius. And in this proposition, she illustrates how women have not been taken seriously for so long, and that if she produced the plays of Shakespeare, they would not have believed her capable of doing it, and that her non-acceptance would have driven her mad in any case. And she wonders how many people, how many women were burned as witches, or were locked up as mad women, because the creativity that they had inside them was stifled and suppressed by the male-dominated society around her. And she says, "Who shall measure the heat and violence of the poet's heart when caught and tangled in a woman's body?" And we know that many of the women who were writing in the 18th and 19th centuries used men's names in order to have their works published, one of the most famous being George Eliot, otherwise Mary Ann Evans. If we look at women in education, we know that if you want to oppress a people, you deprive them of education. And so women have been deprived of education until quite recently. One of the comments that has come to me quite often at the end of this talk that I've given in various forms has been, well, I don't care what you say about women being able to achieve as much as men. And it was Samuel Johnson who said why men refuse to allow the same opportunities to women in education, because if they were, they would overreach the men. That's, well, actually women haven't produced anything in scientific terms. They're not scientists, they haven't produced anything like that, and therefore they can't be, as you say. But in fact, I have a list here of all the women who have won Nobel Prizes. There aren't many of them, but they have won Nobel Prizes. We know of Marie Curie. Since its inauguration in 1901, the prize has gone to 5 women, if the Nobel Prize can be taken as a measure of scientific achievement. Marie Curie, for physics and chemistry. Her daughter, Irene Joliot-Curie, for chemistry, shared with someone else. In 1963, Maria Geppert-Mayer, for physics, that was also shared. In 1964, Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin, a British lady, for chemistry, for the X-ray analysis which elucidated the structures of vitamin B12, penicillin, and sterile derivatives, among others. And most recently, Barbara McClintock of the USA in 1983, for medicine, the first one for medicine. So women have proved themselves as capable as men. I can talk about politics and emancipation, and I was horrified to discover that women did not get the vote in Switzerland until 1970. I can talk about women in work, and still today, in the United Kingdom, women are only 4% of architects, 8% of barristers, 1% of chartered accountants, 0.07% of chemical and electrical engineers, and still only 20% of medical practitioners. So, we can see that, given the same opportunities, women display no inferiority in the educational, academic, scientific, artistic, political arena, nor indeed in any of those occupations which require intelligence, highly technical skills, or business acumen. But one of the problems underlying the whole subject of women is that of language, even names. Women's first names are often diminutive forms of male names. Pauline, Paulette, Georgina, Georgette, Henrietta, Juliana. Women's names are often associated with qualities they were supposed to possess: patience, charity, humility, faith. Names previously exclusively male, once given to girls, fall out of male use. Shirley was a Yorkshire boy's name of long standing until Charlotte Bronte's novel of that name in 1849. How many boys do you know called Shirley? Women are often addressed by their first name when a man of the same status will be addressed by a surname, prefaced with the appropriate social or professional title. Women in published lists of staff in institutions or businesses are given their full first name to distinguish them from the men whose initials only are printed. The academic list for the Faculty of Arts, Department of English, Language and Literature from the University of Birmingham. This is where I studied. J.T. Bolton, B.A., B.Lit, Ph.D. J.M. Sinclair, G.T. Shepherd, D.J. Lodge. I happen to know that these are all men because they taught me. Joan Rees, P. Honan. Marjorie Rigby, Valerie Eden, R.M. Coulthard, L.A. Davis, B.R. Harding, R. Wiltshire, A.R. Fawkes, T.R. Davis, I.C. Small, C.J. Kennedy, M. Walsh. Deirdre Burton, Barbara Roberts, C.W. Whitworth, M.D. Story, T.F. Johns, A. Dudley Evans, P. Scannon, D.C. Brazil. Presumably it's so that when students come to choose their courses, they can avoid choosing a woman. Man, this word man, is chosen as the norm to represent the species in name and in substance. We have Jacob Branowski's The Ascent of Man. So we end up with the totally ridiculous sentence from his book, "Man, being a mammal, breastfeeds his young." The generic use of he, him, or his when gender is indeterminate or unknown. Is this just a convention? There are some who suggest that for women it is a curse. The use of he or she, together, admits that women are special in the sense of not normally included in the human species. Unconsciously and quite naturally, it has been suggested, we all build up a mental picture for ourselves of men being the only participants in every activity as opposed to women. We refer to God as he, though God is beyond any such sexual classification. Even the words man and woman themselves have semantic undertones which are most decidedly slanted. Consider these extracts from Chambers' 20th Century English Dictionary. Manly, bold, courageous, vigorous, stout, noble-minded. Womanly, giving way to weakness. Man, a term of familiar address. Woman, a term of abuse. Needless to say, this would not appear incongruous to the editor. He's a man, William Geddes. And now we have the clumsiness of person creeping in a bid to recognise sexual equality. Chairperson, milk person, police person. In fact, people tend to use chairman of a man, while chairperson is reserved for women. But then we also have Madam Chairperson, please. In 1970, Mary Orevan published an 8-page pamphlet entitled Humanising English, and she suggested including the proposal of a common gender pronoun, co, that's C-O, though not used to replace he or she when applied to an identifiable individual. It was supposedly derived from an Indo-European pronoun ancestor. In 1859, Charles Converse coined the word thon, that's T-H-O-N, and in 1959 it was still listed in Webster's Second International Dictionary. Neither are in common use. Such neologisms never stick. Can you imagine? Each person must get used to co's or thon's new pronouns. The continued generic use of masculine pronouns perpetuates the idea that the male is the norm and the female a deviation. Why not, however, just use they, them, or their, as has been done for centuries? Now, with all this idea of feminine inferiority being underpinned by the very language that we use, it seems that we still have a very long way to go. Has woman then no champion but herself, upon which she may base her hopes for a better, fuller future, on equal terms in every way with the other half of humanity? Well, of course, we know as Baha'is that we do. The Baha'i faith is the first of the world's religions to state unequivocally the equality of men and women as a fundamental part of our faith, as a fundamental belief. And we have the example of Tahireh, the first woman suffragette in Iran, who has been described as the trumpet blast, ushering in the new age of equality. And Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha constantly in their writings and in their pronouncements refer to the equality of men and women. And we are all familiar with the quotation from Abdu'l-Baha saying that humanity is like the two wings of a bird, and if one wing is not operating properly, the bird cannot fly. And one wonders also if there's any significance to the fact that Baha'u'llah received his revelation by way of what he called the Maid of Heaven. He chose a female figure. One wonders if there's any significance to that. The only monarch not to reject the message of Baha'u'llah and the proclamation was a woman, Queen Victoria. The first reigning monarch to accept the faith of Baha'u'llah was a woman, Queen Marie of Romania. And it's interesting that if we look at those believers who arose in America and travelled the world in answer to the tablets of the divine plan, 9 out of 10 of them are women, and one of them went as a husband, which is rather nice, don't you think? And Abdu'l-Baha himself has said that in teaching, women have evinced a greater boldness. And so we have, in the Baha'i community for the first time, a true practice of equality. Now, there are many names that I have left uninvoked in this study for want of time and space. And let it not be assumed that they had no importance or that I'm ignorant of them. Of the modern radical feminist movements, we can say that they have had a value in redressing the balance, because the pendulum, having swung so far in one direction, must swing first in the other before it begins to rest in the middle. But let us not be carried away by their fulminating polemics, which makes them as grotesque as the men they decry. Germaine Greer, Elizabeth Gould Davis, Elizabeth Morgan and others have their value in awakening mankind to the plight of women. They pinpoint the problems most eloquently and mordantly, but they fail to offer the solutions and the framework for action either now or in the future. Only the Baha'i faith provides that. The evidence of history and biology is not enough to change men's minds, for their prejudice stems from deep-seated religious conviction, I would say, coupled with a heavily weighted educational system. It is therefore only through a religion that teaches the equality of men and women that I feel this prejudice can be overcome. Woman is half of humanity. It is time to readmit her into the human race. Our world is doomed without her. I would say to you then, gentlemen, embrace the woman as your sister. Ladies, the challenge is made. Arise and meet it. Or as Juvenal wrote in his satires, clames licet et mare caelo, confundas homo sum. Or as it was interpreted by a feminist writer, you men may raise all the hell you want to about it. I too am a human being. Thank you.
Something about Mary Godwin, who was the mother of Mary Shelley, because it always has bothered me that we say that Tahira was the first either woman suffragette or how we express our relationship to her. Certainly in the Orient, Tahira was the first one to arise. But wasn't Mary Godwin chronologically before her? Because
Yes.
Mary Godwin published The Rights of Women in response to Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man.
1792. It was published, yes. That's right. But it was interesting that as the writer of a book on women and education said, no revolution broke out as a result of the publication of that book, whereas very much so, a revolution in a spiritual sense broke out as a result of Tahir's unveiling herself at the conference of Badasht. It was largely, her work was largely ignored until the present day, in fact. The question was that it seems that women have not produced very much in the field of art in the 20th century, in the arts. Is this in fact true, or is it just apparent? Well, in fact, if you watch television, particularly BBC Two, on a regular basis, they feature quite a large number of women artists and sculptresses and even potters. And I think we can say that once they are given the opportunity, these women have produced just as great art as any of the men in the 20th century. Yes, they do exist, certainly.
They may exist, but they are not big names. There are very few composers, for instance.
The answer is to the fact that we cannot find that many women artists and women musicians. Perhaps they exist, but they don't have the same support and patronage as male musicians and artists would have. Perhaps they are not taken so seriously, and so they are not given the same notice. If all the world's religions have the same spiritual teachings, then one of the fundamental spiritual truths is the equality of men and women. How come they haven't all taught this in the past? In fact, if you look at the examples of the lives of the manifestations, and if you read sometimes the original words as far as one can get them of the manifestations of God, there is very little distinction made between men and women. The Quran makes a couple of allusions, one of them I read you, but by their example, the manifestations demonstrated the equality of men and women, and it is the religions that have grown up in the wake of the manifestations teachings that have made the differences and have caused the oppression of women. And in fact, this particular paper here, called Is Sexism a Sign of Decadence in Religion, has shown that there is a direct correlation between the treatment of women in a religion and how decadent it is, and that the longer a religion lasts, the worse is the position of the women in it. And it is the priesthood in the religion, which has always traditionally been male-dominated, that is the main cause of this treatment of women, and why the strongest arguments are made against women becoming priests, because then that means that they too have authority to change things. Does that answer your question? There's some information here that you may like to read. I mean, for example, Muhammad sought to control the very bad abuse of women in Arabia at the time by raising the ethical concept of marriage by legislation, by giving married women their legal rights in regard to inheritance, and especially by teaching as part of the Muslim faith that women must be treated with justice. The term used to refer to a wife was changed by Muhammad from, you'll have to help me here, aqila, yes, tethered one, to karina, meaning joined. Muhammad certainly improved woman's lot in the Arabia of his day. He prohibited infanticide and prostitution of slave women, and so on. So he did in fact improve the position of women greatly. But perhaps also in answer to your question, and I wonder how much this is also part of the answer to the question that I have often also been asked about the women in relation to the House of Justice. And that is that perhaps man has had to be given the chance, when I say man I mean the male sex, of accepting woman as his equal over a long period of history. And that each religion as it came along, as it were, eroded male domination that bit more, until we have come to the stage of maturity now with the Baha'i faith, where it can be stated unequivocally that the two are equal and redress the balance. The question has been asked whether there has been anything in matriarchal societies that have existed that has counteracted the bad influence of patriarchal societies. Elizabeth Gould Davis, who's unfortunately dead now, has written one book called The First Sex, and in that she describes that the majority of the early civilizations were matriarchal, and that they were run on peaceful lines, developing culture and the peaceful aspects of society, and that they were overrun by patriarchal societies, which from that time on suppressed them violently, and that while the matriarchal societies dominated, the world was more or less at peace, and agriculture and all the arts flourished. But once these early matriarchal societies were overrun by nomadic bands of mainly patriarchal herdsmen, then the situation was reversed, and that warfare became the pattern. If you think about it, a sedentary society based upon settled agriculture cannot afford any kind of warfare. It must devote all of its time to development of agriculture and the raising of crops to feed the population. But a nomadic society is based almost entirely upon warfare, raiding and plundering, going into other people's territory, which necessitates fighting. And these two societies, it seems, have been emblematic of the dominance of women on the one hand and men in the other. And it's the men, it is suggested, who have taken over the matriarchal societies, taken over their institutions, but turned them to their own devices, and specifically to repress the women so that they will not reclaim their ancient heritage. This is how she explains the path of history.